The autumn sun was setting over Washington, D.C., painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Alex, a high school senior with dreams of becoming a lawyer just like his mom, was walking home from debate practice. He'd just won his first major debate competition, and his phone was buzzing with congratulatory messages from his teammates. The streets of Georgetown were quiet that evening, with only the occasional car passing by. Alex adjusted his backpack, filled with debate notes and his winning trophy, while checking the time on his phone. His mom, a respected state senator, had promised to make his favorite dinner to celebrate. The peaceful walk home took an unexpected turn when a police cruiser slowly pulled up beside him. Alex didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were a common sight in this upscale neighborhood. But then the cruiser's lights flashed, and Officer Thompson stepped out, his hand already resting on his belt. "Stop right there," the officer commanded, his voice unnecessarily loud in the quiet street. Alex froze, his heart suddenly pounding. He'd been taught what to do in situations like this: stay calm, be respectful, keep your hands visible. "Is something wrong, officer?" Alex asked, making sure to speak clearly and keep his hands where they could be seen. The street lights were now flickering on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Officer Thompson approached with an aggressive stance that seemed out of place for a routine stop. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description we received." Alex's mind raced. He was wearing his debate team blazer with his school logo, carrying a trophy, and had his student ID card right in his wallet. "Sir, I'm just walking home from school." "I can show you my ID." "Don't move," Thompson barked, cutting him off. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Across the street, Mrs. Patel, who ran the local grocery store, had stepped outside her shop. She was holding her phone, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Alex could see her recording the interaction, something that brought both comfort and anxiety. "Officer, I live just 3 blocks from here." Alex tried explaining, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "My mother is state senator." "Oh, now you're going to tell me you're somebody important." Thompson scoffed, taking a step closer. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Put your hands against the wall." The situation was spiraling out of control. Alex could feel his phone vibrating in his pocket, probably his mom wondering why he wasn't home yet. He wanted to answer it, to tell her what was happening, but he knew making any sudden moves could make things worse. Mrs. Patel had now moved closer, still recording. Other neighbors were starting to notice too. Mr. Rivera from the bakery stepped outside, and the Johnsons paused their evening walk to watch. "Officer, please," Alex said, his voice cracking slightly. "Check my student ID. Call my school. You can verify everything I'm telling you." But Thompson wasn't listening. His face was getting redder by the second, and his hand was gripping his belt tighter. "I said hands against the wall. You're resisting an officer's commands." Alex's debate trophy slipped from his bag, clattering on the sidewalk. The sound seemed to echo through the tense atmosphere. Thompson immediately reached for his weapon, treating a falling trophy like a threat. "He's just a kid," Mrs. Patel called out, her voice shaking but determined. "He walks past my store every day after school." More phones were out now, recording the scene. The evening had turned into a nightmare, with Alex caught in the middle of a situation that was quickly becoming a viral moment in the making. This was exactly what his parents had warned him about, the conversations they'd had around the dinner table about being careful, about knowing your rights but also staying safe. Now he was living it, and all his preparation felt inadequate in the face of raw prejudice. As Thompson moved to grab his arm, Alex could only think about how quickly an ordinary day had transformed into something that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others. The story was just beginning, and its ripples would soon spread far beyond this quiet Georgetown street. Standing there, with his hands now pressed against the cold brick wall, Alex didn't know that Mrs. Patel's video was already being uploaded, that his mother was about to receive a frantic call from a neighbor, or that this moment would become the catalyst for change that nobody saw coming. This was only the beginning, and as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the Capitol building, a new chapter in the ongoing story of justice, power, and accountability was about to unfold. The next few minutes felt like an eternity on that Georgetown sidewalk. Officer Thompson's grip on Alex's arm tightened as he forced the teenager to the ground, ignoring the growing crowd of concerned neighbors. The debate trophy lay forgotten on the concrete, its golden surface reflecting the harsh street lights. "Stop resisting," Thompson shouted, though Alex was completely compliant. Mrs. Patel's hands shook as she continued filming, her voice joining others in protest. "He's not resisting. Everyone can see that," she called out, her grocery store's door chiming as more customers came out to witness the scene. Alex's phone kept buzzing in his pocket, now permanently out of reach. He could only imagine his mom's growing concern as her texts went unanswered. The cold pavement pressed against his cheek as Thompson roughly handcuffed him, the metal biting into his wrists. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," Mr. Rivera muttered, his baker's apron still dusted with flour as he filmed with his phone. "This kid comes by my shop every morning to buy breakfast. He's no criminal." Thompson's face grew redder as he realized how many people were recording. Everyone stepped back. "This is a police matter." His voice carried a hint of uncertainty now, but his actions only became more aggressive. "You people don't understand," Thompson growled, pressing his knee into Alex's back. "This neighborhood has had break-ins. He fits the description." "What description?" Mrs. Johnson challenged from her front porch, her evening walk forgotten. "A kid in a debate team blazer carrying a trophy. Is that what criminals wear these days?" Alex tried to stay calm, remembering his parents' advice. "Officer, please," he managed to say, his voice steady despite his position. "My ID is in my wallet. Just check it, please." But Thompson wasn't listening. Instead, he started listing off alleged violations: resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, failure to comply with an officer's commands. Each charge was more ridiculous than the last, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Mr. Chen from the dry cleaners pushed through the gathering neighbors. "I pressed that blazer he's wearing this morning. It's his debate uniform. This is absurd." The situation reached a breaking point when Thompson pulled out his phone, presumably to call for backup. In that moment of distraction, Alex's phone slipped partly out of his pocket, displaying a missed call from Mom Senator. Mrs. Patel zoomed her camera in on the phone screen. "Officer, look. His mother is trying to reach him. He's telling the truth about who he is." Thompson's face flickered with the first signs of doubt, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Anyone can put any name in their phone," he snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and a woman in a business suit stepped out, her face a mixture of fury and concern. Senator Chen had arrived, alerted by the numerous calls and texts from neighbors who recognized her son. "What is going on here?" Her authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "Why is my son on the ground?" Thompson's demeanor changed instantly. The color drained from his face as he recognized one of the state's most prominent politicians. "Senator, this is your son." "Yes, Officer Thompson," she said, reading his name tag. "And I'd very much like to hear your explanation for why he's in handcuffs outside our own neighborhood." The crowd parted as she approached, phone still recording every moment. Thompson began to stammer, his earlier confidence evaporating. "There were reports, suspicious activity," he matched. "Release him. Now." The senator's voice was quiet but carried unmistakable authority. As Thompson fumbled with the handcuffs, Alex finally felt the pressure lift from his back. His mother helped him up, checking him for injuries while maintaining her composed exterior, though anyone could see the pain and anger in her eyes. "Mrs. Patel," the senator called out, never taking her eyes off Thompson. "I trust you got all of that on video." "Every second, Senator," Mrs. Patel confirmed, still recording. "And I've already sent copies to my cloud storage." The gathered neighbors moved closer, offering their witness accounts and showing their recordings. What had started as a routine walk home had transformed into a defining moment captured from multiple angles by a community that refused to stay silent. Alex brushed off his blazer, now dirty from the sidewalk, and picked up his fallen trophy. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was clear as he spoke to Officer Thompson. "I hope you remember this moment, sir. Not because of who my mother is, but because of who I wasn't to you until she arrived." Thompson stood frozen, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. His radio crackled with a dispatcher asking for an update, but he seemed unable to find the words to respond. The senator wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for being here, for watching out for Alex. We're going to make sure this incident isn't forgotten and that real change comes from it." As mother and son walked to their car, the neighbors began sharing their videos through various social media platforms. By morning, millions would witness what happened on this quiet Georgetown street, and the conversation about police conduct and racial profiling would take on new urgency. The debate trophy in Alex's hand caught the streetlight one last time, a symbol of excellence and achievement that, just hours ago, hadn't been enough to protect him from prejudice. But now, surrounded by a community's love and armed with undeniable evidence, that same trophy would become part of a much bigger story. The police station buzzed with unusual activity that night. The front desk officer kept glancing nervously at Senator Chen as she sat beside Alex in the waiting area, her phone constantly lighting up with messages and calls. The videos from Georgetown had already started spreading across social media like wildfire. "Mom, my wrists still hurt," Alex whispered, rubbing the red marks left by the handcuffs. His debate blazer was dirty and wrinkled, a visible reminder of being forced to the ground. The trophy sat in his lap, its shine now dulled by smudges from the sidewalk. "Document everything," his mother replied softly, taking photos of his wrists. Her calm exterior masked the storm brewing inside. The station's captain had rushed in 10 minutes ago, looking flustered and apologetic. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Patel was there with Mr. Rivera and other neighbors, refusing to leave until they made their statements. Their presence sent a clear message. This community wasn't going to let this incident get swept under the rug. The captain's office door finally opened. "Senator, if you and your son would join me." His tone was respectful, almost nervous. The nameplate on his desk read Captain Wilson. As they settled into the chairs, Wilson cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the bodycam footage and the civilian videos. Officer Thompson's conduct was," he paused, searching for the right words, "discriminatory, abusive, illegal." Senator Chen supplied, her voice level but sharp. "Let's not dance around this, Captain." Alex sat straighter in his chair, his debate training kicking in. "He never let me share my ID, never asked for my name. He decided who I was the moment he saw me." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Thompson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. We take these matters very seriously." "Do you?" Alex interrupted, surprising himself with his boldness. "Because Mrs. Patel told me she's filed complaints about Officer Thompson before. What happened to those?" The captain's face reddened slightly. He clicked through some files on his computer, avoiding eye contact. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken accusations. Just then, the senator's phone buzzed again. Her assistant had sent a news alert. The videos had gone viral. #Justice for Alex was trending, along with clips from different angles showing the incident. The neighbor's quick thinking had ensured nothing could be hidden or denied. "Captain," Senator Chen began, her tone shifting from angry mother to experienced legislator, "here's what's going to happen. We'll make our formal statements. We'll provide the medical documentation of Alex's injuries. But this isn't going to end with just one officer's suspension." She stood up, straightening her jacket. "This ends with real change. Because next time, it might be someone without a senator for a mother. Someone without a dozen neighbors filming. Someone without a debate team blazer to show they belong in an upscale neighborhood." Alex watched his mother with pride. This was why she'd gone into politics, to turn moments of injustice into catalysts for change. Outside the captain's office, the station was getting busier. News vans had started arriving, their lights visible through the windows. Reporters were gathering, drawn by the story of a senator's son being profiled in his own neighborhood. "Mom," Alex said quietly, "can we make sure Mrs. Patel and the others get credit for helping? They didn't just film. They stood up for me when Officer Thompson wouldn't even see me as a person." His mother squeezed his shoulder. "They'll be part of the story. All of it will be, the good and the bad. That's how we make sure this leads to real change." The rest of the night became a blur of statements, photos, and medical examinations. Alex's phone kept buzzing with messages from classmates who'd seen the videos. His debate team coach sent a supportive message, promising to address the incident at tomorrow's school assembly. As they finally left the station near midnight, they found Mrs. Patel still waiting outside, now accompanied by even more neighbors. Someone had brought coffee and snacks, turning the sidewalk into an impromptu support vigil. "We're not letting this get ignored," Mrs. Patel said firmly, handing Alex a cup of hot chocolate. "My own son walks these streets too. This has to change." Looking at the gathered crowd, people of all backgrounds united in support, Alex felt something shift inside him. The fear and humiliation from earlier were still there, but something else was growing stronger: determination. His mother must have sensed it too. "Ready to turn this into something bigger?" she asked him quietly. Alex nodded, gripping his debate trophy. He'd wanted arguing about justice and civil rights. Now it was time to put those skills to real use. "They thought they were just stopping another kid on the street," he said. "Instead, they started a movement." As they drove home through the quiet streets of Georgetown, neither Alex nor his mother could have predicted just how true those words would prove to be. The videos were spreading, the story was growing, and by morning, what happened on that street would spark a conversation that couldn't be silenced. The red marks on Alex's wrists would fade, but the impact of that night was just beginning to unfold. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments: a walk home from debate practice, a neighbor's courage to film, and a community's refusal to look away. By morning, the police department's internal affairs office was flooded with calls. Detective Roberts sat at her desk, reviewing Officer Thompson's file with growing concern. The stack of previous complaints against him, each marked "resolved with no action," painted a troubling picture. "You need to see this," her partner said, turning his computer screen toward her. The viral videos from Georgetown had exploded overnight. News channels were playing the footage on repeat. Alex on the ground, neighbors protesting, the senator's arrival. But it was the newly surfaced videos that caught their attention. "People are sending in their own recordings of Thompson," he explained. "Different incidents, different people, same behavior. Look at the timestamps, going back 3 years." Roberts leaned forward, watching a series of clips showing similar stops. Young people in nice neighborhoods, aggressive responses to reasonable questions, a pattern emerging in crystal clear HD. Meanwhile, across town, Alex sat in his school principal's office. The morning assembly had turned into an impromptu forum about civil rights and community action. His debate teammates flanked him like an honor guard. "The local news wants to interview you," the principal said gently. "But remember, you don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with." Alex glanced at his phone. More videos were surfacing. A college student stopped while jogging. A young professional questioned while waiting for an Uber. Each clip added another piece to the puzzle of Officer Thompson's conduct. "I'll do it," Alex decided. "But I want to focus on the bigger picture. This isn't just about me or Officer Thompson anymore." Back at Internal Affairs, Detective Roberts discovered something interesting in Thompson's training records. He'd skipped several required sensitivity courses, with the absences somehow marked as completed. The paper trail led to a supervisor who'd retired last year. "Look at these signatures," she told her partner. Same handwriting on all the exemption forms. Someone was covering for him. The investigation expanded like ripples in a pond. Each new detail revealed another crack in the system that had allowed Thompson's behavior to continue unchecked. At the State House, Senator Chen was turning her pain into purpose. She'd called an emergency meeting with the Police Oversight Committee, armed with statistics, stories, and solutions. "My son's incident isn't unique," she began, her voice steady. "What's unique is that it was caught on camera by brave neighbors who refused to stay silent. How many others weren't so fortunate?" In the back of the room, community leaders nodded. Mrs. Patel was there, along with other Georgetown residents. Their phones still held the original videos, digital evidence that could no longer be ignored. The police chief shifted uncomfortably as Senator Chen displayed a map of similar incidents. Red dots clustered in certain neighborhoods, around certain officers, telling a story that numbers alone couldn't capture. "This isn't about punishing one officer," she continued. "It's about fixing a system that allowed this to happen, that ignored complaints, that failed to enforce training requirements, that looked the other way until it couldn't anymore." Outside the State House, reporters gathered around Alex as he left school. His debate trophy, now slightly scuffed from that night, caught the sunlight. "What do you want to come from this?" a reporter asked. Alex thought about Mrs. Patel's son, about the college student jogging, about all the others in the videos. "I want change that lasts longer than a news cycle," he answered. "Real change. The kind that means nobody has to film their neighbors being mistreated just to be believed." Detective Roberts' investigation kept growing. Each opened file revealed another hidden pattern, another missed warning sign. Thompson's body camera footage from previous incidents showed a troubling trend of escalation. He was getting worse because nobody stopped him, she explained to her supervisor. "The system didn't just fail last night, it's been failing for years." As evening approached, Alex and his mother sat in their living room, watching the news coverage. His debate trophy sat on the coffee table, a reminder of how quickly life could change. "The chief wants to meet tomorrow," Senator Chen said, reviewing her notes. "Internal Affairs has found enough to start a full departmental review." Alex nodded, rubbing his wrists where the handcuff marks were beginning to fade. "You know what's weird, Mom? In debate, we talk about changing the world, but when it actually starts happening, it feels different. Bigger. Scarier." His mother smiled softly. "That's because real change isn't just about winning an argument. It's about facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. It's about standing up when it would be easier to stay quiet." On the TV, more videos were being shared. But now they weren't just of Thompson. People across the country were coming forward with their own stories, their own recordings, their own calls for change. What started as one incident on a Georgetown street was growing into something larger. The investigation wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a system that needed fixing, about communities finding their voice, about the power of standing together. And somewhere in the city, Officer Thompson sat at home on administrative leave, watching his career unravel on the evening news, finally facing the consequences that had been delayed for far too long. 1 week after the incident, the steps of City Hall were packed with people. Some held signs, others held phones still displaying the viral videos, but everyone held the same purpose. The crowd stretched down the street, past Mrs. Patel's grocery store, past Mr. Rivera's bakery, all the way to the spot where Alex had been stopped. "I never expected this many people," Alex whispered to his mother as they looked out over the gathering. His debate trophy, now a symbol of the movement, sat on the podium where he would soon speak. The crowd wasn't just locals anymore. People had come from neighboring states, each with their own stories, their own videos, their own reasons for being there. News cameras lined the edges of the plaza, broadcasting live across the country. "Look who's here," Senator Chen pointed out quietly. A group of police officers stood at the edge of the crowd, not in uniform, but wearing blue ribbons that read "Time for Change." They were the ones who'd spoken up about similar incidents they'd witnessed, breaking the traditional code of silence. The police chief stepped up to the microphone first, looking both tired and determined. The past week had been rough on the department. Internal Affairs had uncovered more than just Thompson's misconduct. They'd found a whole system of covered-up complaints and ignored warning signs. "We failed," the chief began simply. "Not just last week, but for years before that. We failed our community, we failed our oath, and we failed the good officers who serve with honor every day." The crowd grew quiet, sensing the weight of this admission. In the front row, Mrs. Patel dabbed at her eyes. Her video had started it all, but she wasn't alone anymore. Next to her sat people from across the city who'd captured similar incidents on their phones. Together, they'd created an undeniable record that couldn't be ignored. "My son walks these streets too," she'd told reporters earlier. "Today, we're all here to make sure he can walk them safely." The police chief continued, outlining the changes already in motion. Thompson had been fired, along with 2 supervisors who'd covered for him. But that was just the beginning. New training programs, community oversight boards, and transparency measures were being implemented. When Alex stepped up to speak, the crowd fell silent again. He looked different from the scared teenager in the viral video. Standing straight, voice clear, he began to share not just what happened to him, but what needed to happen next. "A week ago, I was just a kid walking home with a debate trophy," he said, touching the now famous award. "Officer Thompson didn't see that. He didn't see me at all. He saw what his prejudice told him to see." In the middle of the crowd, a group of students from Alex's debate team held up their phones, playing the video that started it all. But now, instead of feeling shame or anger when he saw himself on the ground, Alex felt determination. But here's what's different, he continued. When Mrs. Patel started filming, when Mr. Rivera spoke up, when my neighbors refused to look away, they didn't just record a video. They started a conversation that's been needed for a long time. The crowd murmured in agreement. Signs bobbed up and down, showing similar stories from other neighborhoods, other cities, other times when people had faced the same prejudice. This isn't about revenge, Alex said, his voice growing stronger. It's about change, real change. The kind that means next time, there might not need to be a next time. As he spoke, social media lit up with responses. People shared their own stories, their own videos, their own moments of standing up or wishing someone had stood up for them. The hashtag #TimeForChange trended alongside hashtag #JusticeForAlex. In the back of the crowd, Detective Roberts watched with her partner. Their investigation had opened doors that couldn't be closed again. Other departments across the country were now facing similar reckonings, similar demands for accountability. Think it'll last? Her partner asked quietly. Roberts watched as more officers with blue ribbons joined the crowd. This time feels different, she answered. This time, we've got more than just stories, we've got proof. Near the podium, Senator Chen wasn't just a politician anymore. She was a mother who'd seen her son mistreated, a leader who'd turned pain into progress, a voice for those who needed to be heard. The law should protect everyone equally, she said when it was her turn to speak. Not just those with titles, not just those with cameras recording, not just those who live in the right neighborhoods. Everyone. As the sun began to set over City Hall, the crowd didn't thin. Instead, people lit up their phone flashlights, creating a sea of light that stretched down the street. Each light represented a story, a voice, a demand for change. Alex looked out over the glowing crowd, remembering how dark and lonely that street had felt a week ago. Now, standing here with his community, not just his neighbors anymore, but a whole movement of people ready for change, he understood something important. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if enough people stand together and say, no more. The trophy that had started it all gleamed in the evening light, no longer just a symbol of winning a debate, but of starting a conversation that couldn't be silenced. The state courthouse buzzed with activity on a crisp morning 2 months after the incident. Officer Thompson sat at one table with his lawyer, while across the aisle, Alex and his mother watched as justice took its course. The room was packed. Mrs. Patel, Mr. Rivera, and other neighbors filled the benches, their presence a silent reminder of that fateful evening. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Anderson entered. The rustling of movement filled the courtroom, followed by complete silence. This wasn't just another hearing, it was the culmination of weeks of investigation, testimony, and public pressure. Before we proceed, Judge Anderson began, adjusting her glasses. I want to acknowledge the unusual nature of today's hearing. What we're discussing goes beyond a single incident. We're here to address systemic issues that have been ignored for far too long. Alex's debate trophy sat on the table in front of him, no longer just an award, but evidence. Its scuffed surface told the story of that night better than any witness statement could. The district attorney stood, presenting the findings of internal affairs. Your Honor, our investigation revealed not just Officer Thompson's misconduct, but a pattern of similar incidents that were systematically overlooked. We have documentation of 17 complaints filed against Officer Thompson in the past 3 years alone. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the DA continued. However, what makes this case unique isn't just the incident itself. It's the response we've seen from the community, from law enforcement, and from our legislators. On display were the videos, not just from Georgetown that night, but others that had surfaced. Each one showed a similar pattern, but this time there would be consequences. Senator Chen rose to address the court, not as an angry mother, but as someone determined to create lasting change. Your Honor, we're not here seeking vengeance. We're here to ensure that what happened to my son becomes a catalyst for reform, not just another statistic. She outlined the new legislation being proposed, the Community Safety and Accountability Act. It wasn't just about punishing bad officers, it was about preventing these incidents from happening in the first place. This act will require mandatory bias training, create civilian oversight boards with real power, and establish clear consequences for officers who abuse their authority, she explained. But more importantly, it will protect officers who speak up when they witness misconduct. In the gallery, several officers wearing blue ribbons nodded. They'd come forward after Alex's incident, sharing their own stories of trying to report problems only to be silenced or ignored. Thompson's lawyer presented his client's defense, arguing that he was just following procedure, that he had a clean record, on paper at least, but the evidence told a different story. The paper trail was clean because it was sanitized. Detective Roberts testified, presenting her findings. Complaints were buried, training requirements were falsified, and warning signs were ignored. This wasn't just one officer's failure, it was a system that enabled that failure. As lunch break approached, Alex asked to address the court. Judge Anderson agreed, and the young man stood, his voice steady. 2 months ago, I was just a kid with a debate trophy, walking home, he began. Officer Thompson didn't see that. He didn't see me at all. But what happened next? That's what matters most. My neighbors saw me. They stood up for me. They recorded what happened. And now, we all have a chance to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. The afternoon session focused on the reforms. The police chief testified about the changes already implemented, body cameras that couldn't be turned off, new training programs, and a complete overhaul of the complaint system. We're not just changing policies, the chief explained. We're changing the culture. Every officer now knows that looking the other way isn't protecting the badge, it's tarnishing it. Mrs. Patel took the stand next, her phone, the one that captured the viral video, sitting on the witness stand beside her. I started recording because I knew something was wrong, she said simply. I keep recording because something is finally changing. As the day drew to a close, Judge Anderson delivered her ruling. Thompson would face consequences for his actions, suspension, mandatory retraining, and community service. But more importantly, she endorsed the proposed reforms, giving them the judicial backing they needed to move forward. Let the record show, she concluded, that today marks not just the end of this case, but the beginning of real change in our law enforcement system. Outside the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Alex stood with his mother, surrounded by their community, not just neighbors anymore, but partners in change. Think it'll really be different now? Someone in the crowd asked. Alex picked up his trophy, its surface catching the last rays of sunlight. It already is, he answered. Because now we know, when we stand together, when we refuse to look away, when we turn moments of injustice into movements for change, that's when real progress begins. The courthouse steps were crowded with people sharing hugs, tears, and promises to keep pushing forward. This wasn't just a victory in court, it was a victory for every person who'd ever faced prejudice and hoped for better. 1 year later, the Police Academy auditorium was filled to capacity. Alex stood at the podium, looking out at the fresh-faced cadets in their crisp uniforms. His debate trophy sat beside him, its scuffs and scratches now a reminder of how far things had come. A year ago, I was just a kid with a trophy walking home, he began, his voice carrying across the silent room. Today, I'm here to talk about what happened after, not just to me, but to our whole community. In the front row, Mrs. Patel smiled encouragingly. She'd become a regular speaker at community police meetings, sharing her perspective on how citizens and officers could work together. Her grocery store had become an unofficial meeting spot where officers would stop by, chat with locals, and build the kind of relationships that prevent misunderstandings. The Community Safety and Accountability Act isn't just a law, Alex continued, gesturing to the plaque on the wall that detailed the new requirements. It's a promise. A promise that what happened to me won't happen to someone else's son, someone else's friend, someone else's neighbor. The cadets listened intently. They'd spent the past year training under the new system, one that emphasized community connection over confrontation, understanding over assumption, and accountability over silence. In the back of the room, Officer Thompson sat quietly. After serving his suspension and completing extensive retraining, he'd asked to speak to the new cadets too. Not to defend his actions, but to show how bias can blind even experienced officers. I thought I was doing my job that night, Thompson would tell them later. But I wasn't seeing the person in front of me. I was seeing my own assumptions, my own fears. That's not protecting and serving, that's just protecting ourselves from the truth. The changes weren't just happening in their city. Alex's story had sparked similar reforms across the country. His mother, the senator, had helped other states adopt versions of their law, creating a network of accountability that stretched from coast to coast. But the biggest change, Alex said, picking up his trophy isn't in the laws or the training manuals. It's in how we see each other. Every person who walks down your street is someone's child, someone's friend, someone who deserves to be seen as a human being first. Detective Roberts, now heading the department's new accountability division, nodded from her seat. The past year had been busy, reviewing old complaints, implementing new procedures, and most importantly, creating a culture where good officers felt empowered to speak up. Your badge is a symbol of trust, Alex told the cadets. And trust goes both ways. When Mrs. Patel started recording that night, she wasn't just capturing a video. She was showing that our community cares enough to watch out for each other. In the year since the incident, their neighborhood had changed. The police station hosted monthly community dinners. Officers walked their beats on foot more often, getting to know the people they served. Mr. Rivera's bakery had become a favorite spot for morning briefings, where officers and locals could share concerns over coffee and pastries. You're about to graduate into a different kind of police force, Alex continued. One that measures success not by the number of arrests, but by the strength of relationships. One that sees every interaction as a chance to build trust, not assert authority. The trophy gleamed under the auditorium lights as Alex reached the end of his speech. This trophy was supposed to be about winning a debate. Instead, it became about starting a conversation. A conversation that's still going on in streets and stations across the country. He looked out at the cadets one last time. Tomorrow, you'll get your badges. But today, I want you to remember this. The real measure of an officer isn't in how much authority they can show. It's in how much humanity they can see, in every person, in every situation, on every street. As the applause filled the room, Alex caught his mother's eye in the audience. She wasn't just Senator Chen anymore, she'd become a national voice for police reform, turning one night of injustice into years of positive change. After the ceremony, people gathered in the academy courtyard. Officers chatted with community members, cadets talked with local kids, and the walls that once divided them seemed a little lower, a little less sturdy. Mrs. Patel passed out snacks from her store, while Mr. Rivera shared his famous pastries. The scene was everything they'd hoped for, not perfect, but better. Real. Human. Alex set his trophy on a table, watching as a young cadet asked him about that night. But instead of telling the story of what went wrong, he found himself talking about what went right, how a community stood together, how change began with one person refusing to look away, how progress wasn't just about laws, but about hearts and minds. As the sun set over the academy, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Alex realized something important. The trophy from that night wasn't just a symbol of what had happened, it was a reminder of what could happen when people chose to see each other, stand together, and turn moments of darkness into lasting light.